sent the 12 out into the, what we might say, Jewry, that is the area of the Jews in Galilee and in the southern portion of that area, region of Judea. And we looked at how Jesus sent them, he instructed them, he empowered them, and he warned them. And so we see that there are some essentials anytime there is a undertaking that needs to be pursued. That there are certain things that are required, and Jesus gave his disciples those things which were required. He not only told them how to go, which was 2 by 2. He told them where to go, which was to the Jews only, and he also told them what to say. He gave them their message. And then last week we concluded in verses 11 through 13, where it says he told them what to expect, and that would be in verse number 11, really verses 11 through 15. What to expect, and I would just lump these two together in the lesson, what to expect and how to react. And he teaches them beginning in verse 11. Now whatever city or town you enter, inquire who in it is worthy, and stay there till you go out. And when you go into a household, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And whoever will not receive you, nor hear your words, when you depart from that house or city, shake off the dust from your feet. Assuredly, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. Now, there are some interesting ideas in here that, first of all, really escape us in our understanding, at least so far as that there's no consensus. What, and specifically what I'm talking about is, what did Jesus mean when he said, "Let your peace come upon it"? There's no consensus as to what that means. They understood what it meant, but we don't understand what it meant. Now there are some ideas as to what it might constitute. One thing that we might consider is it might be the case that in letting their peace come upon a household, that God would bless that household. We find that in the Old Testament, where people took care of the prophets of God, and God in turn blessed those particular households because of what they did. That could be one thing, but what it was exactly we do not know. But it's one of those things where I've been teaching on Revelation in my weekday Bible classes, and it's interesting that there are a lot of things that are I say a lot of things. There are quite a few things in the New Testament that we don't know what they are, but the people who received the letters know what they are. Now, there are some things that have not been revealed to us that the first century church knew. Like, let your peace come upon it. Whatever that means, they understood it, even though we may not have a consensus on what it means. And so, but he told them, first of all, that they were to go into a house and inquire who was worthy. Now, I don't know if you picked up on this, but there was also the possibility that when they inquired as to who was worthy, that person may have ended up not being worthy. Did you see that in the text? When you go into a city or town, look what it says. Inquire who in it is worthy. But then you get down to verse 14, it says, "But whoever will not receive you nor hear your words, when you depart from that house or city, shake off the dust from your feet." And so what I gathered just from this is that sometimes folks that may be deemed worthy by others prove themselves not to be worthy.
Somebody asked somebody, hey, these people are right.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, have you ever, has anybody ever commended someone to you in some area?
Yes.
And it turned out that it wasn't but here's the thing. It's not that the individual was deliberately trying to steer you wrong. It's just that there were some things perhaps that they didn't know or understand.
Well, they might have thought they were good guys.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think that's what we see. That's what we see here. Inquire who is worthy, and go to that house. And then it turns out that house might not be worthy. And so, again, it's just a very interesting situation when we think about that these men are going out with no means of self-support, nowhere to stay, and nothing to eat. No money to buy anything that might be required of them. And so, the Lord is really, we talked about this last week. He's really instilling in them the necessity of having faith in God. That sometimes you're going to have faith in God and things are going to work out the way you hope that they do. And other times you have faith in God and they don't turn out the way that you think that they will. But that's not God's fault. We have to have a faith in God when things go our way and when things don't go our way. I can give you an example, and I'm not going to say who, not that it's anybody here would know particularly, but I was talking to somebody not too long ago, and there was a situation that was going on, and it involved the court system, and they were telling me, look, we've put this in God's hands. We trust that God's will is going to be done, and we're not going to worry, so to speak. We're going to pray about this thing, and whatever God wants to be done will be done. Well, guess what happened when court time came? It didn't go their way. It didn't go their way. So then they decided to pursue another course of action to make things go their way. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, what happened to God's will in all this? You say you're praying that God's will be done, but it doesn't go your way. So now you're gonna try something. You're gonna do something else. Now look, I'm not saying that in every particular case that it may not. For example, it may not be. There may not be some reason to continue to pursue a thing, But don't tell me you're trusting in God for God's will to be done, and then when whatever happens, and you don't accept it. You don't accept that as being God's will. I mean, do you see where I'm going with this? You're going to give God a chance to give you what you want. Yeah. So it's like but what Jesus was instilling in his disciples was, when it goes your way, have faith in God, and when it doesn't go your way, have faith in God. And and in this particular case, in this text, things didn't go their way, and they didn't have a place to put their head. It wasn't just like some kind of life situation where a decision went one way or another, and and it went heads when you called tails. That's not what's at issue here. When these guys got kicked out of a house, they were homeless, so to speak, right? And so Jesus is instilling in the disciples, and by the way, this is just a taste. This is my opinion, okay? That these first 15 verses, Jesus is giving them a taste of what it's going to take to fulfill the Great Commission when the church is established. And I think verses 16 and following don't have anything to do with the immediate mission in the limited commission, but rather that Jesus is preparing them for what's really going to happen when they have to go out and start preaching the gospel in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the uttermost parts of the earth. And now let me explain why I think that. All right, so let's be reminded. Why is it called the limited commission? Why is it called the limited commission? Only for the Jews. That's right. Only for the Jews. All right. Now, look at verse 18. You will be brought before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. And then there's some other things that follow along with that warning. Now, this statement doesn't comport with the ideas of the limited commission. You know, for example, we don't have, and I know that the fact that the Bible may be silent on a thing doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't happen. But we don't have any record or even the slightest insinuation that the apostles were imprisoned on the limited commission, or that they were brought before governors and kings. By the way, governors and kings are Roman appointed officials, and perhaps the Herods or those under the direct authority of Caesar. Given the scope of the limited commission and given in the limited time that the commission was to be carried out, this statement doesn't fit or comport with the idea of the limited commission. But it exactly comports with the carrying out of the Great Commission. Right? They did get carried before governors and before kings, and for example, specifically, even though Paul wasn't in this particular group, Paul was carried before governors and kings, and the things that he taught were given literally as a testimony to the Gentile people, to governors of Felix and Festus and others of import in Rome. He was in Caesar's prison. He was in Rome, and Paul's imprisonment became a testimony to the Gentiles. So this reaches out to me to the Great Commission and not so much the limited commission. Also, you look in verse 21. Now, brother will deliver up brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. We don't have any idea that this was the case in the limited commission, but we do have it as a specific case in the Great Commission. For example, turn over to Matthew chapter 24. And by the way, if you want to put your ribbon in chapter 24, we're going to come back to it in a minute. Matthew 24, beginning in verse 9, it says, "They will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Then many will be offended and betray one another and hate one another. And he who endures to the end will be saved." Now this is obviously on a time frame chronologically well after the limited commission. And Jesus is warning about the exact same things in Matthew 24 as he warned in the latter half of Matthew chapter 10. So I think Jesus is talking, beginning in verse 16, about things that are going to happen to them after all the events of Jesus' life take place, his death, his burial, his resurrection, and the establishment of the church, and then the preaching of the gospel to the whole world. And then you have verse 23. and this one's also mentioned in the book, in the lesson, particularly beginning with the most difficult verse of the passage to understand is before the Son of Man comes. The most difficult verse is, what did Jesus mean when he said, when they persecute you in this city, flee to another, for assuredly I say to you, you will not have gone through the cities of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Now go back to page 11. We do not know what he meant. And with that, I heartily concur. This is another one of those statements where we don't know exactly what Jesus meant when he said, before the Son of Man comes. Now, having said that, what does the next line say? It says it could be that he was speaking about his coming in judgment when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. And I don't think that's a possibility. I don't think that's a possibility at all. You remember when I told you to put your ribbon mark in Matthew 24 because we're going to go back to it? Well, now's the time. Go back to Matthew 24. Look at verse number 14. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Now he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And what does he say about the destruction of Jerusalem? He says, the gospel will be preached to every single person in the world before Jerusalem is destroyed. And the Bible tells us that the gospel was preached to the whole world in the days of the first century. So that obviously does not comport with, you won't make it all the way through Israel before the Son of Man comes. Because they did make it all the way through Israel before the Son of Man came. All the Jews had the gospel preached to them before the destruction of Jerusalem. And so it can't mean, to me, the phrase before the Son of Man comes can't refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. I think it's far more likely. The second idea is he simply meant he would be coming along behind them to the same cities. Jesus didn't send them out and then go on a vacation, while they were out doing their thing. And so in my mind, I'm thinking this is a far more logical explanation than any reference to the destruction of Jerusalem, because of what it says with regard to the preaching of the gospel to the whole world. All right, and so let me get down to the last line in that same paragraph is what we've been talking about. He was preparing them for the future. The limited commission was preparing them for the future great commission. It would be like Mason works for John. Okay? And Mason has worked for John for a number of years now. All right? But when Mason first started working for John, let's say somebody comes in and they need a 350 rebuilt. John's not going to turn Mason over on day one to go rebuild a motor, is he? What's he going to do? He's going to give him some of it, and then he's going to give him some of it, and then at some point in time later, John can say, "Hey Mason, go rebuild that motor." Is that accurate, John? In other words, Mason's not ready to rebuild a motor on day one, maybe not even year one. Because I don't know the learning curve there, right? Because I'm completely ignorant of those things. When I mean completely ignorant, I'd have to know something just to be ignorant. All right? But he prepared him, and even right now, he's preparing him to be the proprietor of Big Boy Automotive. And it's a good thing that Mason's big, or that whole thing wouldn't make any sense. All right? And so Jesus is preparing his disciples in a small way for something that's going to be far greater in the future. And to me, that makes all the sense in the world. All right? And then, let's see. Now let me just say this about this when the Son of Man comes. I don't have to know what a thing means in order to know what it doesn't mean. I don't have to know what it means to know what it doesn't mean. For example, if I were looking at some extended mathematical equation, and at some point in that equation somebody said 2 plus 2 equals 5, I don't have to know what the answer to the equation is to know what? Whatever answer they arrived at is wrong. Why? Because one element of that equation is incorrect. And if one element of an equation is incorrect, the whole thing is going to be incorrect. And so I don't have to know what verse 23 means to know what it doesn't mean. And so I would just say that. All right, now bottom of page 11. What we can learn from these instructions about our mission work today. First, organization is needed, but keep it simple. Do as much organization as needed to be effective. Do not do so much that nothing gets done. In other words, analysis paralysis. What is analysis paralysis? You got so much data you don't know what to do. Or in that same vein, you spend so much time trying to figure out every single contingency that you end up not doing anything. We can't go out until we have every single contingency accounted for. That's not going to work. And so just enough, Jesus gave them just enough to do what they needed to do. Isn't that right? He didn't overload them. He gave them three or four basic commands, 3 or 4 basic instructions, and then he turned them loose. And so, what is true in Congress is also true in churches, and that is, if you want to kill an idea, give it to a committee. Because congressional committees and church committees are where ideas go to die. Because there's going to be an over-analysis of what's going on. So you need organization. Number 2, you need instruction. You need instruction. Let me just... In relation to the church doing its work as being the sole recipients of the Great Commission, we had a Fishers of Men program here in 2000, year 2000. And there was about 15. There's at least 15 of us, wasn't there, Ann? Probably at least 15 of us that were involved in this intensive training program. I mean, it was an hour of homework every night for 6 nights, and then a 2.5-hour class on the night that you didn't have homework. And this went on for 11 or 12 weeks. All right? Now, that program did us a lot of good. I think it did us a lot of good. But there's a sense in which there was way too much on the front side of that before we got to the back side of it. And what I mean by that is there were a lot of things that we spent a lot of time studying that we really didn't need to study before we went out and started talking to people. You know, and the way the lessons are laid out, you know, you really don't get to the most important part, which is what is sin and what did God do for sin, and you know, what do I need to do in response to that, until like lesson 5 or lesson 6. You know, and there was so much on the front end that was so unnecessary to getting us to lesson 4, lesson 5, and lesson 6. And so what I'm saying is, a lot of times we get overwhelmed by how much we think we need to know before we go out and talk to people, when there's only a small amount that we really need to know. If you really want to think about it, there's not a whole lot that we need to know in order to talk to people about their soul. Think about, you know, in Acts 8 and verse 4, you know, they went just average, ordinary people. It says they went everywhere preaching the word. How much do you think they really knew? How much do you think they really knew? You know, probably less than we studied in the first 5 weeks of Fishers of Men. But the point is that we shouldn't overload ourselves with the idea that there's a massive amount of instruction or knowledge that we need. You know, we just need to go. We need to focus more on the going, you know, and less on what we think we need to know. Also, in the third paragraph under that main heading, you know, the team approach has benefits. The team approach has benefits. And that's true also. That's also true in local evangelism. I think it's really, really true in overseas evangelism. You know, I know some young guys. One of Andy Kaiser's sons is in that group. There were 3 or 4 couples that all went to Peru at the same time. You know, rather than one couple going to one place and another couple going to another, rather than having 4 isolated couples in 4 remote places, they were all together in one place, and they were able to do a great work there. Because it's very difficult to do overseas mission work by yourself. When I mean by yourself, even as a husband and wife team. This was never made more apparent to me than one year. We were in Ghana, and we were doing our preachers seminar, and a car rolls up and a white guy got out. You just don't see that in Ghana very often. Guy's name was Greg Larson. Greg was the director of the Village of Hope, which was an orphanage 6 hours away from where we were. It was a 6-hour drive to get from where he was to where we were. And you want to know why he drove 6 hours one way to spend a day and a half with us? Because he was lonely. He hadn't seen, and look, I'm just saying this he hadn't seen anybody that looked like him, or had any background that was similar to him in a long, long time. A long, long time. It meant that much to him that he drove 6 hours one way just to see 3 other Americans. Just to see 3 other Americans. And that's a source of discouragement a lot of times for missionaries when they go out, is that feeling of isolation. Look, some people manage to get over it. They manage to work through it. But many don't. I think about the work that's going on with Robert and Mary Martin in the South Pacific. There's about 4 or 5 couples over there. Now, they don't all live together, but they're in proximity with one another. And it makes a huge difference when you're when you're 10,000 miles from Northwest Alabama, where you grew up. So there's a lot of wisdom in what our Lord did in sending those men out 2 by 2. But it also is helpful when we go out locally. For example, when we were doing Fishers of Men, Stephanie had some studies. The lady lived out behind Fulton Bridge Church, out in the sticks. And when she had a study, I would go with her. And there's a lot of reasons for that. She conducted the study, and I just sat there and kept my mouth shut unless somebody asked me a question. Same with Dana. When we went, and Dana had some studies right after the 2021 thing we had with Rob Whitaker. I went with Dana. Dana conducted the studies. I literally sat in the floor. And just kept my mouth shut. And this is not to say anything in me, but I know it had to be helpful for Dana for me to be sitting there. Ma'am?
It gives you encouragement and safety.
You feel safer. And there's somebody there's somebody there that can help you if you need it. Same thing with the situation with me. Same thing with me and Stephanie. She conducted the study, and I was just there. And it makes a huge impact. We need to be doing more of that. We need to be doing more of that, going out together. All right, look at verse 34. I said we were going to get to the end of the chapter. There were some things that were important at the end of the chapter. And verses 34 to 39 are extremely important. Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it." This is not nearly as difficult a text for those of us that were raised in the church as it is for those who are not. That's first or second? Okay. Because I was raised in a household that believed and practiced the truth, endorsed the truth, stood for the truth. So therefore, it was easy. It was an easy decision. It was an easy decision for me to become a Christian because of the way that I was raised. I have no idea how difficult it is for a person to. I don't want to use it this way, but I don't know how any other way to say it, to forsake or to turn their back on the teaching that they received from some family or trusted individual. I don't know that struggle. I've seen people struggle with it. I've seen people struggle with it and overcome it. I've seen people struggle with it and not overcome it. I've seen people struggle with it, overcome it, and then go back. And we need to be sensitive. We need to be sensitive to the. We need to be sensitive to the struggle that people undertake. Whenever they make a decision to obey the gospel. There are some of you in this audience that basically, and I hate to use the term "turned your back," but I think it's accurate that you turned your back on the religion of your youth to become a New Testament Christian. And what you did was one of the bravest things that anybody could ever do. Because you put so many things at risk. You put so many things at risk when you do that. You potentially isolate your parents from yourself, or your siblings, or whoever it is that your grandparents, or somebody who raised you or whatnot. And so, we need to be keenly aware, because for those of us that were raised differently, it's just so plain. It's just so plain. Just why don't you do that? And we don't understand the internal struggle that people do, because people can see what it says, and they can understand what it says. But for many of them, there is a definitive cost that has to be counted. And so, when people do that, we really need to uphold that decision, and encourage them and let them know, you may have to give up one family, but you've got another family. And the Bible describes that as such. Look, verse 37 is pretty clear. He who loves father or mother more than me, not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me, not worthy of me. And then for those of us that we need to be reminded, he who does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. Jesus demands our 100% total allegiance. Everything that we do and everything that we are has to be placed in submission to the authority and the teaching of the Lord Jesus Christ. And when we don't do that, we find ourselves unworthy of Christ, according to what he said. All right, any thoughts before we get our last bell? All right, we're going to go on to lesson 45 next week. I wasn't really enamored with a lot of the questions that are on page 12. So, Lord willing, next week we will pick up on page 13 and lesson plan 45.